Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I just finished reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I knew next to nothing about this book other than its legendary status and the fact that it's a Western epic. Previously, I had read a few of Cormac McCarthy's novels, namely No Country for Old Men and The Road, and they left a definite impression on me. Going into this book, I caught wind of some of Cormac McCarthy's greatest literary influences. People call him the perfect disciple of Herman Melville, who of course wrote Moby Dick. And then there's William Faulkner, who wrote many remarkable literary pieces, such as Absalom, Absalom, and As I Lay Dying. His writing also takes heavy influence from the Bible, specifically the King James Version. And of course, the Grandmaster, William Shakespeare, who needs no introduction. Already that set a fascinating foundation for me to step into the world of Blood Meridian and to help me digest the content as well as color my interpretations of the work. My immediate impressions were glowing. It was brutal, but fascinating. It had been a while since I'd been this enamored by the style of writing of any book. After the first chapter, I was blown away by the incredibly cinematic literary experience that this book is. I told several friends at work of my impressions and that I was just blown away by the writing. And that's not something that happens often. Usually I keep to myself on what I'm reading. And not only is it cinematic, but it features a very poetic writing style that is loaded with symbology. Indeed, it feels very biblical at times. Each word feels like it has been typed with the weight of mountains. There's some quality about the writing that makes it feel like it's ancient as time itself. There were a number of paragraphs that I read that made me stop, take a walk, reread, and then just ponder their meaning or marvel at the poetic choice of words. I think it's worth taking a moment to just read a few of those paragraphs. I'm going to choose chapter 5, which was one of my favorite chapters. There's so many moments in this that I just was like, oh my god. So first, this perfectly encapsulates the feeling of the desert for me. The kid spat dryly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A lizard came out from under a rock and crouched on its small cocked elbows over that piece of froth and drank it dry and returned to the rock again, leaving only a faint spot in the sand, which vanished almost instantly. Then there's this paragraph, which seems to be a bit of a fan favorite. They crested the mountain at sunset, and they could see for miles. An immense lake lay below them, with the distant blue mountains standing in the windless span of water and the shape of a soaring hawk, and trees that shimmered in the heat, and a distant city, very white against the blue and shaded hills. They sat and watched. They saw the sun drop under a jagged rim of the earth to the west, and they saw it flare behind the mountains, and they saw the face of the lake darken, and the shape of the city dissolve upon it. They slept among the rocks, faced up like dead men in the morning. When they rose, there was no city and no trees and no lake, only a barren, dusty plain. And finally, which is actually the first paragraph of this chapter, but I think connects nicely with the next points I'm going to be making. With darkness, one soul rose wondrously from among the new slain dead and stole away in the moonlight. The ground where he'd slain was soaked with blood and with urine from the voided bladders of the animal, and he went forth stained and stinking like some reeking tissue of the incarnate dam of war herself. Like I said, my initial impressions were glowing, but what a daunting and mesmerizing experience. Now, I've heard about the violence in this book, and I've heard that a lot of people actually had to put the book down because it was too much to process. And I thought to myself, I've watched my fair share of war films that are quite brutal and traumatizing, so I felt like, I built enough tolerance to be able to process this book. Nothing could have prepared me for what I had coming. Carnage and massacre of biblical proportions. This book made me feel drunk from the blood on the pages. Honestly, I feel like I marched through this book in this drunken, feverish haze of blood, dust, and sweat. And at the center of all this violence is Judge Holden. I won't go into too much detail to avoid spoiling the discovery. But for those brave enough to venture into this bloody wasteland, by all means. And frankly, I'm still processing his towering presence. Suffice it to say that he is a terrifying character. His power doesn't come so much from his brute strength, it's his intelligence, his omnipotence. There are several speeches he makes that are worth rereading and pondering. There's an evil genius and logic to it all, and there's almost this religious aura around him. Essentially, in his view, God is war. And this is going to be a bit of a spoiler, so for those who want to actually read the book for themselves and see this and experience it for themselves, by all means, skip to the end. But for those who are interested, here we go. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat, and he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die. Folks, this was a heavy read, and one that will take residence in my mind forever. Usually I read the synopsis at the beginning, but for this special occasion I saved it for last. So let's read it from the jacket. Widely considered one of the finest novels by a living writer, Blood Meridian is an epic tale of the violence and corruption that attended America's westward expansion. Brilliantly subverting the conventions of the Western novel and the mythology of the Wild West, its wounded hero, the Kid, a 14-year-old Tennessean, must confront the extraordinary brutality of the Glanton Gang, a murderous cadre on an official mission to scalp Indians. Seeming to preside over this nightmarish world is the diabolical Judge Holden, one of the most unforgettable characters in American fiction. Based on historical events that took place on the Texas-Mexico border in the 1850s, Blood Meridian represents a genius vision of the historical West, one whose stature has only grown in the 25 years since its publication. It's one hell of a story. Throughout my reading journey, I was listening to one album in particular. That will be The Seer from Swans. Aside from being a brilliant 2-hour epic, this is a terrifying sonic experience. An excellent comment was made by the YouTuber Deep Cuts. He called this album a cathedral of fear. I can't think of a more appropriate way to describe this album. Lunacy is a particular favorite of mine, and the first 2 minutes in particular are extremely appropriate for this kind of literary journey. And then the demented wailing and the madness-inducing drums of 93 Avenue Blues perfectly captures the brutality of this book. Finally, the 19-minute A Piece of Sky emulates the mystical nature of Blood Meridian. And on a side note, I recently saw the outstanding film Tar. It's been 16 years since Todd Field's last film, and apparently during that 16-year period, he explored the possibility of making an adaptation of this novel. It's an incredibly cinematic experience, ripe for a talented filmmaker, but I can only imagine what kind of roadblocks he had due to the beyond excessive violence of this book. It's also a very curious coincidence that it also happens to be 16 years since Cormac McCarthy's last novel, The Road, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. Anyway, today at the age of 89, he just released 2 books this fall, The Passenger and Stella Maris. I will definitely add them to my collection when the occasion presents itself, but I will need to take a long break before I read any more of his works. All that being said, I'm very much interested in immersing myself into those literary influences I mentioned earlier on in this video. I think I'm going to start with Herman Melville's Moby Dick, however. And that is all for today. As always, wishing you lots of love and health to your family and friends. Take care of yourselves and talk to you soon. And on a side note, actually, I went to see a live presentation from the National Theatre in London of Henry V, a Shakespearean play. And it's curious because I found this film ticket at chapter 5 of the book. Yet another very interesting coincidence that I thought was worth mentioning. Bye-bye now.